Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Online, I've seen a lot of people talking about this brush set from Amazon. So today I'm going to test it out and see if this is the best beginner brush set for painting your Warhammer minis. The brushes come in this tube, which does give a nice first impression and makes a difference from the cardboard that most of the cheap brushes I buy come on. Although it calls it a dry brush set, there is a selection of brushes, not just chunky dry brushes. Here is the selection of brushes that come in the set, ranging from the large, round-headed dry brushes, traditional style brushes for applying base coats and highlights, and some flat brushes which I've used in the past for dry brushing, especially on smaller areas. This is one of the brushes from the set, the number 2 detail brush. Out the pack it has a nice tip to the bristles, but with synthetic brushes, the test is always how long the tip will last. Some can last ages, others will quickly hook or spray out. It's always a gamble with cheap brushes. And this is the model I'm going to paint using this set, the Renegades of Pain Dogma Keeper by Wargame exclusive, which should make an excellent Traitor Guard Commissar proxy for games of 40k. As you can see, I've primed it black to give a nice smooth, even base coat for the colours to work from. First of all, I'm coming in with some Abaddon Black, and I'm going to use that size 2 brush. And I'm painting the Abaddon Black all over the cloak to this model. It may seem odd to paint black over black, but the finish to the primer is different to the paint. So this way, any mistakes I make later on can easily be tidied up by painting over them with some Abaddon Black. I'm painting all of the fabric, hat, and the rest of the uniform black, so this will give a nice base colour for the uniform. It's only fitting that a Traitor Commissar wears black. The brush is working fine, it's laying a nice smooth layer of paint all over the mini. Once the bristles were wet, they were a lot more flexible, and they go over the model nice and easily without getting caught up on any of the details. After the Abaddon Black has been applied, all of the fabric has its base coat, and now I'm going to test out some of the dry brushes. So with some Corvus Black, I'm going to dry brush the areas we just painted with Abaddon Black, using the size 3 dry brush. This one is pretty big, but it should do what I need it to do. The bristles are firm, but should be soft enough so they don't pull off the previous layer when you're dry brushing. I've loaded my brush with Corvus Black, and now I'm rubbing most of the paint off onto a paper towel. I just want to leave a little bit of black on, so when I'm dry brushing it will just catch the raised details and leave the Abaddon Black showing in all the recesses. Now I'm quickly flicking my brush back and forth across the model. I'm not applying any pressure to the brush, as the bristles lightly rub over the model. They will leave a little bit of paint onto the model, but leaving the darker colours in all of the recesses. The brush is working fine. It's pretty much just a makeup brush, which you can use as an alternative if you don't want to buy this set. Few hairs did come off the brush as I was dry brushing. This does often happen with new brushes like these. It shouldn't cause an issue as long as you can flick them off the model before the paint dries, so they won't ruin your model. With a large brush like this, getting to the inside of the cloak is a little bit difficult. You could switch out to a smaller brush if you wanted for these parts, but I managed to get there with a bit of patience and the larger dry brush. With the Corvus Black dry brushed on, you can see how the raised areas have been picked out, but the darker black is still showing in all of the recesses. Now I'm coming in with the darkness. Instead of the normal grey I highlight black with, I'm going to go for a blue highlight to give a different and more mystical look to the mini. Now I'm using the size 2 dry brush, much like before, dry brushing all over the model. By being even lighter than before, the dark blue will be left on the areas that were caught with the Corvus Black in the previous step, but also leaving some of the darker black showing through. Dry brushing like this is a great way to quickly and easily get transitions of colours on your models. By being lighter with the pressure on each pass, you'll build up the colours and quickly get a great effect from dark to light. As you can see, the dark blue is catching on the raised areas of the cloak and uniform, but leaving the previous colours showing as well. So this will give a nice subtle blue highlight to the Traitor Commissar's uniform. With the darkness applied, you can see the blue hue that is given to all the uniform. Now there's only one more dry brush to apply to bring the blue out more. From Thousand Suns Blue, I'm applying another dry brush, this time using the size 1 dry brush. I want to be as light as possible with this one. I'm focusing on sweeping across the model from top to bottom, so only the upwards facing surfaces are caught. This will help give the impression of light coming from above, and keep the much lighter highlight as subtle as possible, so the uniform should look to be black and not blue. This is catching a lot of the areas that will be painted with other colours later, and that's fine. Dry brushing is a messy painting method, which is why it's always a good idea to do it before painting everything else. I'm making sure I catch all of the uniform with this dry brush. With the smaller brush it's much easier to catch the inside of the cloak, but I'm being careful I don't apply too much pressure. I want this to be quite a subtle highlight. After that Thousand Suns blue highlight, you can see how all the edges have been picked out, and there is a nice blue highlight to all of the black. Now I'm going on to paint some blanched berry using the size 2 detail brush. And with this I'm going to pick out all of the trim, so I'm being careful around the black of the cloak. I'm just picking out the trim at the bottom with a couple of layers of blanched berry. As these brushes have solid tips so far, it's pretty easy to pick the raised details on this model. By gently catching the raised area, it leaves a nice layer of paint. It doesn't run off and accidentally catch areas I don't want to paint. As well as the cloak, I'm also catching the trim at the bottom of the jacket to keep the look of the model tied together and break up that black a bit. With the blanched berry applied, the trim has been picked out and added a pop of colour to the model. Next, with some blighted green, I'm going to paint the tassels. For this I'm using the size 1 brush, so it's a bit smaller, and I'm picking out the tassels with a couple of layers of dark green, being careful around the rest of the cloak and making sure I don't accidentally get this over the black. By being careful and not overloading the brush with paint, it's easy to pick out these details without accidentally painting over other areas. I'm also picking out these details on the front of the jacket with the blighted green. This will add some colour to the front of the model, and a dark green seems like a fitting colour for the detailing on a commissar who has fallen to chaos. With all of the green details picked out, it's added to the chaos look of this model. Next, with some ivory white, I'm going to paint the mask. Using the size 1 brush again, I'm picking out all of the mask to the model, being really careful when I'm close to the areas of black. I'm just applying a couple of coats of ivory white until I get a solid cover all over the mask. I'm also picking out the horns on the hat as well. Ivory white is a great base for bone details, especially if, like me, you're using the John Blanche paints. With ivory white applied, it's really brought out the bone looking appearance of that mask. So now I'm coming in with some Banshee brown and I'm going to paint some of the leather details. I'm using the size 0 brush here as I'm dealing with some very small areas. And first I'm picking out the gloves. This brown will give a nice leather appearance to these areas. I'm also painting the pouches on the model with the Banshee brown as well. As always, being careful around the other colours, but just applying a couple of layers of Banshee brown to any areas that I want to be leather. The Banshee brown has given a nice dark brown appearance to these areas, so next I'm going to paint any straps on the model. For this I'm using Ruddy Terror and the size 0 brush again. And I'm going to pick out all of these straps. The Ruddy Terror gives a nice sort of terracotta colour to these areas, which once knocked back with a shade, works really well with the dark leather areas. This is where I notice perhaps the first problem with these brushes. They have quite a long lead hair, which is great for getting excellent placement of the brush, but it's almost too long, so as the rest of the bristles come to the model, this lead hair can end up touching and painting thin marks on other areas. It's not a big problem, but it is something to keep in mind if you are using these. I've come across the same thing with other brushes in the past, and sometimes I've trimmed down this lead hair so it's not much bigger than the rest of the bristles. I'm also catching the belt at this stage as well, painting this with a couple of layers of Ruddy Terror, adding some brightness to the uniform of the Mini. There are also some straps on the legs holding on the armour plates. These can be a little bit difficult to get to, but if you tilt the Mini you can normally find an angle to paint the details in hard to reach places. With the Ruddy Terror applied, the model's starting to come together now, but the next detail I'm going to paint is the hair. For this I'm using Moonbeam Yellow. This should give a nice pop of colour and brightness to the model. I'm using the size 0 brush again, and I'm carefully painting all of the hair, being very careful to avoid painting the hat, cloak or mask at the same time. Coverage of yellow over black is never great, so this is going to take a couple of layers to build up to a nice solid yellow colour on the hair. With the hair painted, it's really brightened up the model and added that pop of colour. Next, with some heavy metal, I'm going to paint everything I want to be a steel coloured metal. Using the size 0 brush again, I'm painting the blade to the power sword. Later on I'll be painting a glow effect onto this blade. Metallic paints can cause damage to your brushes. The little flakes of metal can cut the hairs and cause them to wear out quicker. This is one of the reasons I always have some cheap synthetics in my collection, so I don't have to use my expensive sable hair brushes with metallic paints. I'm also painting these spike epaulets on the shoulders. Every Chaos model needs some spikes somewhere. There are also these skull details on the leg armour that I'm going to catch with a couple of layers of heavy metal as well. With the heavy metal applied, there's only one more base coat left to paint on this model, and that's going to be with some Emperor's Gold to paint all of the gold details. With the size 0 again, I'm painting the details like the hilt to the sword. Any trinkets on the model, because it wouldn't be a Chaos model without some gold trinkets. There's also this star hanging from their waist. I'm catching this with some gold. And there's a little bit of trim on the leg armour, so I'm just catching this with a couple of layers of Emperor Gold. With the gold applied, there's all of the base coats applied to this model. So the next step is going to be to shade the miniature. So first up with some warm skin shade and the size 0 brush again. I'm applying the shade to the mask, the hair and the horns on the hat. This shade works really well over the ivory white and gives a great bone effect. We'll darken down the hair a bit, but still keep that blonde colour. I'm being careful to not get this over any other areas, just shading the parts I want with the warm skin shade. Now with some Voodoo shade, I'm going to shade everything else. This will be the tassels, the leather, straps and metallics. I want to make sure I catch all of these areas with a shade of Voodoo shade. I'm being careful not to shade any of the areas of black, as this has already been highlighted, but everything else I'm catching with a shade of Voodoo shade. If you enjoyed the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below. After the shades have dried, you can see they've added definition all over the miniature and darkened down some of the brighter colours. Now it's time to start highlighting. The first highlight I'm applying is Midnight Olive, which I'm going to apply to all of the tassels. For this I'm using the size 0 flat brush, as I'll apply this with a light dry brush. The bristles are firm with a flat top, which makes easy dry brushing, just catching the raised areas, leaving the shades in the recesses. As before, I'm removing most of the paint onto a paper towel, so only a small amount remains. This will make sure I don't paint those areas, instead of just catching the edges of the details. Now I'm gently running from the top to the bottom of the tassels, leaving some of the lighter midnight olive on the raised details we've already painted and shaded. Making sure I only dry brush over the tassels, making sure I don't accidentally catch any of the cloak in the process. As these details are raised up, it's fairly easy to avoid the cloak, as long as you don't apply too much pressure to the brush. Now with the 000 super detail brush, I'm going to paint the details on the coat to the commissar. This brush has a really fine tip, which is great for small highlights. Does mean the brush won't hold a lot of paint, so you will have to return to your palette more often to top it up. I'm catching these small round points and just applying a small spot of midnight olive to the top of these areas. With just the tip of the brush making contact, the highlight will be a small spot, giving a subtle brighter colour to these areas. With the midnight olive applied, it's slightly brightened up those areas, picking out the details and adding some definition to the mini. Now with some ivory white, I'm going to highlight the mask and horns. And once again using the 000 fine detail brush, and I'm applying a small edge highlight to any raised areas on the mask. Where the shade has settled into the recesses and darkened down the ivory white base coat, this will brighten up some of the most raised details, but allow all of the shade to show through. I'm picking details like any sharp angles around the nose, jaw and cheeks. I'm also catching any raised parts in the horns as well, with a small highlight of ivory white. With the ivory white applied, it's added definition to the face, so the next area to highlight is the hair. For this I'm using Moonbeam Yellow again, with the 000 fine detail brush. And I'm carefully picking out the raised parts of any of the sculpted hair. I'm keeping my paint nice and thin for this, because I don't want the highlight to be too bright. I just want to pick out some of the strands of hair and brighten them back up after they've been darkened down by the shade. Small brushes are ideal for this. This one only holds enough paint for 1 or 2 strands of hair at a time, but it means you don't overload your brush and end up having paint flow into the shaded recesses. One thing to note with small brushes, you do have to wash them quite often. You don't want paint drying on the tip, or you'll not be able to get the fine lines with them. With the hair highlighted, the model's really starting to come together now. The next thing I'm going to highlight are the leather details. For this I'm using Sunburst Ochre and a 00 precise detail brush. This is a slightly larger brush than the 000, so it will hold a bit more paint, but still has a fine point. With this I'm applying a fine edge highlight to all of the edges of the glove, picking out the sharp edges as well as any raised details on the glove. This ochre colour works well with the brown to give a worn leather appearance with just a few simple highlights. I'm making sure I catch all of the raised details on the gloves and catching them with just the very tip of my brush to give them a fine edge highlight of Sunburst Ochre. I'm also doing the same to the pouches, making sure I catch any raised details with a fine edge highlight of Sunburst Ochre. With the leather highlighted, there's only one thing left to highlight before I start applying a glowing effect to the power sword. And that's going to be with a 50-50 mix of blanched berry and ivory white. I'm going to highlight the trim on the cloak. Using the 00 brush again, I'm catching the very edge of the trim with a thin edge highlight of this mix, keeping the lines nice and small and just making sure I catch all of the raised details. For the bottom of the cloak, I'm using the side of my brush, as this is a nice straight edge. Using the side allows me to get an even highlight all the way along the bottom of the trim of the cloak. And I'm doing the same for the trim on the commissar's coat as well, using the side of my brush to just catch the very edge of the trim and give a nice fine highlight. With the trim highlighted, you could leave the model here, but there is one more thing I'm going to do to really add some interest to the mini. With the darkness first, I'm going to dry brush onto the sword to create a power glow effect. Using the flat size 0, I'm dry brushing across the blade, adding a small amount of this dark blue. I'm focusing this the most towards the hilt of the blade, so as I move across the blade I'm doing more brushes towards the hilt. This will build up and give a stronger colour near the base of the sword and give it a transition as the colour gets stronger as it goes down the blade. Now with some Cantor blue, I'm doing the same thing but starting a bit closer to the base of the sword than before. This will leave some of the darkness near the top and add a brighter colour towards the base. Once again, focusing this towards the base of the sword, so as we brighten up our colours over the next few steps, this will build a great transition from dark to light. Now with MacLeod blue, I'm doing the same again, but starting a bit closer to the base of the sword. Dry brushing is ideal for this as it allows me to slowly build up these colours to get that great transition along the blade. Next with Altdorf Guard blue, I'm doing the same again, but focusing this into a smaller area near the base of the sword. You can see how that transition is starting to build from the dark blue near the tip to the brighter colours near the base. Now with some Calgar blue, I'm working in quite a small area here, just catching that lower part of the blade and brightening it up, so I get that smooth transition from the darkness all the way to the Calgar blue. Now with some Thousand Suns blue, I'm really focusing this near to the point where the power node is. This is where I want to be the brightest point and give the impression of the power fading away as it moves along the blade. It doesn't matter if a little bit of this ends up on the gold details, this will just help give the impression of a glow from the blade, a quick way to do some object source lighting. And finally with some Temple Guard blue, I'm being really light with this step. I just want to catch the smallest areas and the sharpest points with the brightest colour. I want that top edge of the blade to stand out and the rest of the colours to mix together and create a great looking power effect. I'm also gently brushing away from the power node towards the Commissar's hand. This will catch the very edges of the gold details and give the impression of light coming from the blade. I'm not going too heavy with this, just lightly catching the edges of these areas to add an interesting glow effect to the sword. With the power sword painted, that is the Renegades of Pain Dogma Keeper by Wargame exclusive, painted using just this cheap set of brushes from Amazon. The brushes work pretty well. They kept their points well, and besides the long lead hairs on some of the brushes and a few loose hairs on the dry brushes, they've held up well. For the price, this seems like a pretty good beginner brush set. Let me know in the comments down below, are you going to pick up these brushes, or are there any other sets you would like to see me take a look at? Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, an extra special thank you to Jenkins, our Tea Lover channel member. Thank you so much for the support, and happy painting!